Oh, yeah.
Subscribe to StevensvilleGamers, my dudes.
Game design talks. I hope everyone is doing pretty well. I'm going to pull up the presentation. This one's going to be about difficulty. No, unfortunately, this one applies a lot more to video games and maybe tabletop RPGs, a little less to things like trading card games or board games. But it's something I really wanted to talk about. It's been on my mind, and it's something that's really important to consider when designing, especially a video game or a tabletop RPG. Difficulty. I guess we'll just jump right into it. So this is a game design talk by Warcrime Zulu, hosted by StevensvilleGamers. It'll be up on that channel about 5 p.m. today. What is difficulty, and why should I consider it? Difficulty is the amount of effort one must put into learning and beating your game. The vast majority of single-player games have varied difficulty settings in one way or another. Competitive games' difficulties are determined largely by their complexity and by the gap between the skill floor and the skill ceiling, i.e., how good you can be at the game without any experience versus how good you can be at the game if you sort of devote your life to it. Smash has a medium skill floor and a high skill ceiling. Fortnite has a low skill floor but a pretty low skill ceiling. So there are several schools of thought as to how and why you should provide several modes of difficulty and complexity. But first, I want to discuss why different players like and appreciate different levels of complexity and how one might go about using that to their advantage. So, why easy difficulty? Why do players look for easy difficulty? One thing that we need to do as game designers is understand how to design games not just for ourselves, but for everyone. Some people don't really understand why someone would want to play an easy game. Some people don't really understand why someone would want to play a hard game, but it's our job as game designers, much like in understanding all the psychographic profiles, to sort of understand why other people play games. So I might play a game on easy difficulty if I'm appreciating a game for its lore and story and I don't really care to improve at it. I might play it on an easy difficulty if I'm often busy and I don't have time to master the game's mechanics, but I want to play it. And lastly, I might play on easy difficulty because I'm not very good at games in general, but I want to experience this game. So, easy difficulty definitely has its place, and you might want to design like a From Software style game where everything is incredibly hard, and that's the whole point. But there is a case for games being accessible to everyone that I'll make later. There's a really interesting debate on it. But that's why, those are the general reasons why people play games on easy difficulty. And then why hard difficulty? I want to show how good I am at this game. I have a lot of time on my hands and I enjoy mastering the mechanics of a game. Or I want to prove that I'm hardcore. Someone who's super into a game is going to want to prove that they've mastered the mechanics. They're going to want to prove that they are passionate enough about a game that they're passionate about that they have learned how to be very, very good at it. And that's generally the motivation behind people playing games on hard difficulties, people doing special runs where they limit the resources they have access to, those kinds of things. So you have to design your game to be playable and enjoyable for those people as well. Radical accessibility is something I want to talk about, and this is an interesting debate that's popped up in game design pretty recently. So radical accessibility is the idea that games must feature a mode, format, or difficulty that can be played by anyone, regardless of their mastery of the mechanics or familiarity with the game. The argument for it is that it allows anyone to experience a game regardless of their skill level or how absorbed they are in the game, which is generally good. The argument against it is that it cheapens the experience for hardcore players and makes the effort they put into games matter less. And at its worst, it leads to things like Fire Emblem Fate's Phoenix mode, which is a mode in a tactical role-playing game where, rather than your characters dying permanently or even coming back at the end of the chapter, they come back at the end of the turn and you can't lose. And the argument made toward people who want modes like this in games is just go watch someone else play the game on YouTube or Twitch. Because if it's to the point where you're not engaging with the mechanics of the game at all, you just want the lore, you might as well just watch someone else play it and allow people who are interested in learning the mechanics to actually play the game, which I think there's a decent argument for. At the same time, it's reasonable to want the game to be a little bit easier so that you can play it, but it also does make it a little harder to discuss the game when you go into spaces for discussing the game and it's full of people who beat it on casual or Phoenix mode or whatever, and you would like to discuss strategies for beating it on the highest difficulty, or just strategies for beating it on classic mode. You're interested in getting better at the game, and they're just interested in experiencing it. And so you're looking for two different things out of the same game. And radical accessibility tends to widen that gap. With that said, I'm generally in favor of it, as long as it doesn't get to the point where your players don't have to even engage with the mechanics of your game, at which point they should probably just be watching a playthrough. How do we scale difficulty and complexity? There are several ways to scale difficulty to create a game experience that is suitable to all types of players. Let's discuss each one. So the first one is difficulty selection. This is the most obvious one. It simply asks the player to decide how hard they'd like the game to be. This can be a traditional difficulty selection menu, or something like a choice between ranked or casual in a competitive game. Now the pros of this, you're giving the player more control over the experience, as well as allowing players who want a harder experience to have some recognition of their accomplishments. It is very easy to choose at the beginning of the game whether you want normal, hard, very hard, easy, whatever, without necessarily knowing much about the game. But the cons, and I think this is a big one, a recurring theme in the field of game design is that your players don't really know what they want. And allowing them full control over how complex and difficult their playthrough will be can result in them picking the wrong option. So even if you've designed these options with different types of players in mind, a player who's a little bit more apprehensive and might not think as highly of themselves about how good they are at games might choose an easier difficulty than they need to and kind of plow through the game and become disengaged. And on the reverse, a player who ties a lot of their self-worth into how good they are at games and doesn't want to be seen as somebody who's weak might pick a harder difficulty than they can handle on their first playthrough and get burned out because of how difficult it is. So it's hard to not only implement game difficulties that are flexible and that fit the needs of different players, but it's also hard to name them correctly so that the players who need specific difficulties will find them. To make it look like your normal difficulty or your easy difficulty is not baby mode, and to make it look like your hard difficulty is as hard as you say it is and no harder or less hard, because you want people to find the right difficulty for them. Now, this next one is post-game difficulty ramp, and this one's pretty interesting. This applies pretty much exclusively to video games and tabletop RPGs, but it's an important one. It's where, after the completion of a relatively easy main campaign, the players have access to much more difficult extra content. A lot of Bethesda games tend to do this. Pikmin, the Nintendo game, does this. The pros are it allows anyone to enjoy the main game and allows people who are motivated to master the mechanics to prove their chops after the game. It also allows players who might have been unsure about their ability to master the mechanics to slowly ramp up to the point where they can conquer that harder difficulty, and it gives them a sense of pride from that, which is really cool and important. The cons are that you have to make the main game a bit easier, which may turn off some players. If all of your difficulty is going to be backloaded to after you beat the game, you do have to make the main game a bit easier, and that might get a couple players who would otherwise really enjoy your post-game content turned off and decide that the game is too easy for them. So that's the kind of folly, that's the kind of risk that you run, I guess. So that's post-game difficulty ramp. And then the last one I want to talk about is an interesting one. It's modular difficulty. So this mode of difficulty selection allows players to turn specific dials to fully control their gameplay experience, including difficulty. Now, trading card games are by default modular. They give you a choice of formats, and you get to decide how complicated the cards you include in your deck are, even within those formats. And by choosing a format, you kind of have a little control over what your opponent will play, vis-a-vis like what you're going to play against. So for the example, I put the Binding of Isaac character select screen up there. There's a lot of different things you can choose. You can load your own seeds. You can choose from a lot of different characters to kind of decide how difficult the game is going to be for you. Now, the pros of modular difficulty are, for people who are intimately familiar with your game and its mechanics, it allows a fully flexible experience, complete control over how the game is going to play. And that's really valuable for games that you think people are going to get super into and play over and over again. But the cons are that it demands knowledge of your game's mechanics in order to be effective at all. And it can be really daunting to new players, especially if it's done incorrectly. You're kind of dumping a lot of information about mechanics on them before they really know how those mechanics work. If you're asking a player before their first playthrough to decide how many cashews they're going to start with, but they don't know what a cashew does, what they can use it for, they don't know whether they should start with more or less, they don't know how many would be a good idea. If you're kind of modular difficulty can overload players with information if it's not done very delicately. So that's my warning about modular difficulty. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. I know this was a bit of a short one, but this was the Game Design Talk about difficulty. What do you believe is the role of difficulty in games? How do you feel it's best handled? And what topic would you like me to cover next? Let me know in the comments. I will see you again in 2 weeks. This video will go up on StevensvilleGamers at 5 p.m. And I hope you all enjoy it and enjoy the next one and have a good couple of weeks.